So it was a sequel-themed weekend at the theater, and we got Soderbergh's new movie on Netflix. So those will be the three movies we're talking about this time around. And we're going to start with Zombieland Double Tap, which is another one of those movies that might seem like one of those long-delayed sequels, and it's like, is it really still a good idea or not? But they very persuasively mention in the interviews that apparently this was hard, like, it was only by circumstance that this was a long delayed thing. Because I guess as soon as the first movie came out and received the success that it did, they were all, pretty much everybody was ready to go and do another one almost immediately. But then there were just other setbacks that happened. I think mainly like script issues, which is obviously an important issue, but it did make it seem like, and especially with the four of them, all of which have gone on to, that the advertising loves to play up the fact that they've all gone on to Oscar glory in one way or another, with Abigail Breslin and Woody Harrelson had already received nominations by the time the first movie came out, but when the second one came out, Eisenberg went on and did The Social Network, and Stone has since gone on to three nominations and an Oscar win. So you'd almost think they are maybe like above this in a way, and Harrelson has had two more since the first movie also. So it's like, did any of them feel like maybe they might have been above this? And not at all, and you can tell, which is going to be really important to this movie, and whether or not it's going to work. It's like, even if there are some things in the movie that may fall short, or may seem a bit lazy in the creative department, that chemistry is going to go a really long way. It's just a matter of if you can keep all the characters together or not, which is one of the main conflicts of the movie. So, when the chemistry is one of the strongest things about the characters, that's an interesting choice. But it begins, and you know it's already going to immediately be having as much fun as the first one was, with this little creative spin on the Columbia logo, just immediately as it starts. And then it's goes into the whole 10-year gap thing, which is something that kind of, I feel like they maybe could have taken more advantage of than they did. Where you can see how they still haven't, like, there's still nothing particularly solidified about them. That's one of the main aspects of what Eisenberg has going on throughout the movie, is him trying to find them like a permanent home sort of thing, while they've just been wandering for the past 10 years. Um, and we do get some of the stuff, like, they make some of the changes to go along with that, but they also make sure to put some of the stuff in that might seem similar, basically to tell you that it's still welcoming, but we also know there should be a lot of new things also. One of the big examples of this being the Metallica opening credit sequence, where it's Master of Puppets this time, but still kind of gives you the same feel and kind of gives you the same sort of revved up feel that opening credit sequence from the first movie did in this really big way. Um, so they're not, so in a way, but it didn't necessarily feel like they were trying to replicate it, which I could see being a criticism. It was just sort of like welcoming you back into the world, which I think worked in an effective way. But that's not to say that some of the things here that they do try to bring back, they don't necessarily always land or always feel fitting. But like when I was talking about them, they're always parting ways. Like, one of the running jokes in the first movie was that Emma Stone and Abigail Breslin just kept sort of running off. And I feel like, because the movie is self-aware enough, to the point that Eisenberg even makes a reference in his narration to the fact that you are sitting in a theater watching this. But of all the things that they call out themselves for, one of the things they didn't, at least that I don't remember, was that the movie begins with Stone and Breslin running off again. And it's like, this is one of the things where I kind of wish they'd taken more advantage of the whole setup, with the 10-year gap, was that I feel like this would at least be the perfect time to bring up a joke that was like, how many times have they done this because that was what they just kept doing in the first one. It's like, how many times have they done the leave a note and run off thing in the 10-year gap? And it's like, oh, this is just another one of those happenings. But no, they play it up like it's an almost permanent thing, and there's like immediately another month gap, and we just kind of keep going from there. So And that's something that kind of felt like a bit... I feel like with 10 years working on a script, you could have maybe come up with a bit more of a solid conflict. Because there is a lot, like a lot of the movie, way more than there needs to be, is the relationship drama between Eisenberg and Stone, which I had a feeling was going to be an issue going into it, because it's like, with where we leave them from the first movie and how that was kind of sort of building between the two of them, it's like, oh, now we're gonna have to deal with that. Like it really could have felt kind of fresh in the way, like how the whole thing about the 2009 movie was the way that it like sort of took the stuff that kind of felt redundant at the time with zombies, but just the whole thing felt really fresh about itself and its attitude towards the whole thing. And with this, it's like to go... I feel like they could have kept up that sort of freshness by getting away from conflicts that seem totally obvious, but instead it's a conflict that you can see well before you even walk into it, and they do go with it, and it's a big portion of the movie. About how they're handling their relationship, and are they... Because obviously Wichita doesn't want to do the commitment thing, she doesn't want to get too attached, despite the fact that she's more than willingly accepted this relationship. I don't know, but him wanting to do like an unofficial wedding, because it's not like they can actually do that, is what pushes her away and makes her run off for a month. And so you can see a bit of and there's like basically throughout the whole movie, they kind of really did Wichita's character dirty, because she's so inconsistent like through the whole thing, and she's so contradictory of herself like constantly. You could say that's a character flaw and not a writing flaw, but when you see it, it really feels like a character, or a character flaw, or no, a writing flaw. Jesus, it's a flaw. It's a flaw in general, because there's also a whole scene where, on top of the relationship stuff, where it gets to the point that Eisenberg has to do something, something crucial. And she's the one saying, hey, there's no attachment. You've got to do this. You've done this like so many times before. You can do this again. It's just this sort of thing. And she's the one building him up to do that. And when he goes and he does the thing, she like looks shocked. And it's like, it feels like there's a lot of that with her character through the entire movie. So that was kind of a bummer. So and then there's also... as far as Tallahassee goes, you can tell that not only does Harrelson just fall right back into this role, but you can sense that he was probably super eager to do so as well, which is great. But every now and then there's a little something with him also, particularly towards like going into, not quite the end, but going into the end, where there is a scenario where in order to get into a safe place, it's like a whole pacifist place, so they have to not only give up their guns, but their guns are like melted in whatever the hell that was, so that they just don't exist anymore. And there's just a cut between Tallahassee saying like, there's no fucking way that is ever going to happen, and he makes like a whole scene about it, and then it just kind of cuts to them in there, and that's what has happened. And it's like, I just really can't imagine... I feel like that could have gone a totally different direction, because I just feel like there's no way... Like, I feel like there's a reason they didn't show Tallahassee give in and let his guns be melted, because you just can't imagine it, because it's not the fucking character at all. And then he goes out by himself, gunless. And it's like, these are... You really think they wouldn't be making these decisions 10 years into this, but... like I said, the 10 years thing, it feels like sometimes it's here and sometimes it's not. So that's a little confusing and off. And then there's some jokes that are just... This might sound like a lot of negativity, but there's a lot of positives to it also. But another thing is a joke, because it's one of the biggest jokes in the movie, and they spend a lot of time on it, but it felt a little too familiar. Which is interesting given what the joke is. I didn't really think about the weird, I guess you'd say, irony of that. But it's the scenes with Luke Wilson and Thomas Middleditch, which you may have heard because they've been talking about it in interviews and shit. That Luke Wilson and Thomas Middleditch play basically two guys they run into that are pretty much exact copies of Tallahassee and Columbus. And it's like, that's when I heard this. I was in one of the interviews. I was really expecting somebody to bring it up, and nobody did. So it made me wonder if they even like thought about it. But yes, that is a joke in Shaun of the Dead, where they run into the group that looks exactly like them with Martin Freeman there and all that. And it's like, it'd be one thing if that joke felt familiar from another movie, but that it's another zombie comedy really makes it stand out. And did you put any effort into this joke at all? And they spend some time on it also, obviously, because they got Luke Wilson and Thomas Middleditch. But it's so yeah, just to take that joke already that was so funny in Shaun of the Dead because of how short it lasts. It's just like a hi goodbye thing. But to make it like a whole big deal in this, and to make multiple jokes of the same thing, and it's like, hey, you act like them, but it's like, oh, they complain about them, but oh, they're complaining about themselves, and it kind of goes on and on for a joke that was already done so passively in another movie. Another much more successful movie in this little zombie comedy genre, too. But it does lead to a very, like, well-shot attack scene, so there is that. Now, to talk about, the positives, there are, it can still be very funny. Like I said, the chemistry still really does go a long way, particularly between Harrelson and Eisenberg. Especially since they've still got, like, that totally opposite, where, like, you can sense that they've kind of been doing this for 10 years, but they're also, the banter between them hasn't really changed much, which is for the better, because that's what we love about them. And there's a lot of jokes around, like, you'd almost think we'd get tired of this because of how much they do it. But there's consistent jokes throughout about the rule list that he makes, and, like, the changes that have been made, and then Thomas Middleditch has his own thing, and it's, they actually end up doing a lot of funny stuff with that. There's one particularly really clever joke about it that Harrelson makes shortly after we meet Zoe Deutch's character that's very funny. And yeah, speaking of that, there is the introduction of the Zoe Deutch character, which is basically just this sort of, like, really over-the-top, ditzy type character that seems almost entirely oblivious to what's going on around her, except for the fact that she's been living in a freezer for a while, until they find her. And this is where Zoe Deutch's talent really shines, because I've praised her before, but as far as, like, her real comedic talent here does go along with, because this is a character that, with a lesser talented actress, you would just be waiting to die. And I could see some people even still thinking that about her, just the character in general. But and it's not always, like, I guess, my type of humor what they're doing with her. But I can address that it does take, that it is a really good showcase for Deutsch's comedic talent, so there is that. And there's also, kind of a clever scene where I thought they were making a bit of a mistake, but then as the scene went on, you realize what they're doing, and it's actually really clever, where, Zoe Deutch basically accidentally creates Uber, where she just kind of describes that would be a great idea, and then that's, like, halfway through that scene it occurred to me, the joke isn't just that she's basically creating Uber, like, throwing the idea out there, but that because the apocalypse started in 2009, that Uber is something that does not exist in this universe. So as that kind of dawns on you, it becomes a much better joke, so... Because at first I thought the joke was going to be, like, she's so dumb, she's talking about something that already exists, but, yeah, it's the fact that, no, in this universe it doesn't exist. So I like that they were able to kind of play with that sort of continuity a little bit. And they do, in some of the ways they've updated some of the things from the previous movie, like how Columbus had the Zombie Kill of the Week thing going on, and because so much time has passed now, they do Zombie Kill of the Year. And we get to see some really, like, creative stuff done with that, kind of just spliced in throughout there, which does work. And then but even so, talking about the stuff, the callbacks that do work, like the Kill of the Week and the rules and all that. There is still some stuff where it kind of feels like reference just for the sake of reference and callback just for the sake of callback. The whole thing with clowns and Eisenberg in the first movie, and his irritable bowel syndrome. Two things that, like, never really only came up except, like, once. And it's like where it seems like something they're going to make a really big deal out of, and then it's all for like a 10-second scene in the first movie. And they bring back the clown thing again. I guess technically because of the conflict it makes, it actually makes more sense here than it did in the first movie, even though it's still just something that lasts for a split second. But it's still... Because there's also a callback to Amber Heard's character in the first movie. The girl from, like, the apartment next door to him that turned into a zombie. Where he compares the beauty of, like, I think Zoe Deutsch to her. And it's like, I would say in 10 years... This is where it kind of gets fuzzy to me. It's like, you would think in 10 years, surely they've met other people to where the girl in the apartment is, like, kind of a distant memory at this point. But it's got to have its references to the first movie, so whatever. So, yeah, and then there's the whole idea that the zombies' intelligence is kind of ramped up a little bit, and they can set traps now, and all that kind of stuff. So the updates do work, and about half of the callbacks work, but then half of them feel kind of desperate. But it does all lead to a really good climax. Like, the climax is another case where it's like there's only so much you can do with zombie climaxes where, like, they all kind of get in one place, and then it's gonna... but they actually do something that's kind of just as thrilling, I guess you could say, as the climax in the first movie, but still feels different in a big way. So yeah, there's a lot to complain about, but there's a lot of stuff to, like, kind of praise too. And it's like you kind of, because it took so long and they were all so into it, you kind of feel good for them. That the movie finally exists. And yeah, it's not a total waste of time, which it totally could have been, being, you know, a sequel of this type. But yeah, they have enough here to where I'd say it's worth it that they did it. But I don't think it quite has the... it doesn't quite feel like they went kind of above and beyond to sort of... as far as, like, having the first one, which, like I said, felt so, you know, fresh and new around the time it came out. And that's not quite there anymore, but it's fine. And you need to stay through the credits as well, so there is that. Another thing I kind of thought they were referencing just for the sake of referencing, but I appreciate that it's there. So, yeah. So let's go on to Maleficent, Mistress of Evil. One of my big, gigantic complaints about the first movie was the fact that Maleficent wasn't all that evil, so that title kind of stuck out to me, but we'll see if it lives up to it or not. So, as is clear, if you've been watching these, I'm not a fan of the first movie, really, at all. Not even at all, really. But the thing about that, though, is that even though I think what they did with the Maleficent character in the first movie was kind of appalling, given to how we know the character, at least from the other movie, it is worth noting that I don't really care for Sleeping Beauty either. So I'm kind of backed into a corner as to how I'm going to feel about these movies, but I kind of went in with a bit of an open mind to this, at least I'd like to think I did. So what they came up with here was, the first off, talking about the way her character is now, where she's, like, motherly towards Aurora, and it's like, oh, you're basically my daughter now, and all that bullshit. There is, this opening scene where we get, like, it kind of sets up the image of Maleficent that we had going into, like, the first movie, where she's evil and dark and kind of scary. So there's this nice kind of opening scene where these dudes are trying to take things that they shouldn't be taking and are attacked. And the first reveal of what they're being attacked by is this sort of pan down where we see the horns from behind. Where it's like, it would be like a really cool evil entrance for Maleficent if we didn't realize she's being just all motherly towards Aurora now. But it does make this, like, her kind, seem very, like, dark and scary and all that. So it kind of gives you the vibe of, well, I kind of really wish they had had something like this in the first movie, but here we are. But of course, because we know the story, we know it's not actually her or anything. But yeah. So we open up, and the CGI is still as shoddy as it was before, still as weird as it was before, especially when we see the three fairies flying around, Melda Staunton, Leslie Manville, and Juno Temple. One of which is we kind of sum up the events of the first movie, and then one of them says, "Yes, she's not Sleeping Beauty anymore." And then another one says, "Oh, I see what you did there." And it's like, oh, that's one of your opening lines, so that's the kind of shit we're going to be dealing with, I guess. But no, that's really kind of the only, like, meta reference they do, which, in retrospect, makes it even weirder that it's even in there at all, but whatever. I guess they thought it was clever when they wrote it, so it's still in there. And it's opening with Aurora being, you know, the head of everything, and then she is proposed to by Philip. Philip, who has been recast to Harris Dickinson, who is a significantly more talented actor than Brenton Thwaites from the first movie, so they upgraded him, so that's a good start. But the whole news of this impending wedding is interrupted because Michelle Pfeiffer, who is Philip's mother, decides that she wants to be a villain now. So she's going to curse his father and then unleash, basically trying to tell the world that Maleficent is actually evil. So basically Michelle Pfeiffer turns into us at the start of the movie, saying, like, well, you know, everything's all happy and hunky-dory, supposedly, but you remember Maleficent did this, and Maleficent did that. She cursed you, she almost killed you, she picked up her father and dropped him to his death. But it's basically Michelle Pfeiffer doing the equivalent of going back and pulling out Maleficent's old tweets. To say, well, remember when all this happened? Am I the only one that remembers this? She's actually a bad person. And then this turns into a whole thing where Maleficent, well, she lashes out, so everybody, I guess, assumes that she's evil. But they already assume that she's evil anyway, regardless of the events of the first movie, because her mythology, or whatever you want to call it, is still there. So this is probably the sloppiest way to describe this movie, but that's pretty much what it felt like watching it. So yeah, and then she goes back to her other kind, where Chiwetel Ejiofor is there, and others, and eventually a war is going to happen, and it turns into exactly the kind of movie you think it's going to be. So really, the main attraction of this movie for anybody over the age of 12 is Angelina Jolie and her performance, where it was one of, like, even the people that hated the first movie still praised her for being, like, not only the perfect casting choice, but giving a performance to match that, at least as well as she could, given the material. And she has these little snippets where we can see, like, just an overall evil Maleficent can totally work in her hands, and it's probably the movie we would rather see. But they are making a children's movie, so there is that. But and we get moments like I said, I did really like that first line, that line in the first movie, that's said a lot more sinisterly in the advertising than it was in the movie itself. And that's when she's kind of hiding behind a tree and she's luring Aurora in, and Aurora says, like, you know, don't be afraid, and it's like, why won't you come out? And she says, because you'll be afraid. And it's like, there's little moments like that here also, where she's got, like, that sort of attitude about her, where it's like, she kind of has that vibe where you can tell people, like, it gives reason for people to act petrified around her that think she's some, you know, mythological monster or whatever. But she's also kind of got that sort of fun evil about her. She seems like she's having more fun with the evil side in this one than she was in the first movie. And then it's like when they're going to the dinner before for the wedding announcement, when she looks at them all prepared and she's like, pitchforks, humans are hilarious. And it's like, stuff like that is kind of what would be great if this character was that. But it's pretty much this scene, and then she's like all deathly serious and wounded for the rest of the movie. And then the movie just gets boring, and it's like you really want sort of this part of her. And there's even moments where, like, sort of expected stuff and played out scenes that she still makes work. Like, when Sam Riley's trying to teach her how to be, like, cordial, which she's just so not used to. So she's basically practicing, like, her greetings, but she's still, like, really stiff and terrible at it. It's the Terminator 2 scene, basically. That's been redone before, but she still makes it work. And every now and then there is, like, a sincere moment. There is one line when she says, like, love doesn't always end well. And she says it with such sincerity, it's almost like, it's almost kind of awkward, given how close all this is to the Brad Pitt situation in real life. And it's like, you can kind of sense the place she was in when she probably said that line. But every now and then stuff like that still comes through, even though when she's having a lot more fun with it is the real appeal here. But they, for some reason, want to shy away from that as much as possible. But, you know, whatever. And it was like, but the way she's able to sort of focus on that, at least a little more in these opening scenes than, like, only going for the sympathy thing, which seemed to be the only thing the first movie was interested in. At least my vague memory of it. But yeah, once she goes off with her other kind, and then it's the back and forth between the humans and them thing, it becomes very boring very fast, if you weren't bored already. And to think that this, and it's kind of boring in the same way the first movie was, but this one is 20 minutes longer, and seemingly endless. But every now and then there is something there that kind of grabs your attention. Like, there's this hench person, I guess, that Michelle Pfeiffer has, that basically does all of her dirty work or whatever, and she's basically, there's something intriguing about her, but she's not really there enough, and she's basically Michelle Pfeiffer's Boba Fett, where she's like, she comes off really hardcore and she does a couple of hardcore things, but then ultimately, like, goes out in a really gloriously stupid way. It's just really abruptly. And they don't really use that to the extent that they could have. Yeah, so other than the weird animation I was talking about before, there's still, like, there's kind of, like, creature designs in this one that kind of stand out and feel a bit creative. But it's still, like, the shoddy animation doesn't really do them justice, but you can see the ideas there, so there's a little something. But overall, any creative, you know, flow that went into this movie, it just kind of kills with this whole middle to end portion that kind of brings it all down. When it seemed like they really had something like the first 20 minutes or so there, which is kind of a letdown, because I was kind of like, oh, maybe I was onto something, you know, giving it the benefit of the doubt and being open-minded going into it and not just saying, oh, I hated the first movie, so I'm going to hate this too. It has a pretty decent first 20 minutes, but then, yeah, like I was saying, it's just they go off and they do a lot of, there's a lot of times where it felt very similar, they felt very similar to the Na'vi and Avatar, and it just feels very, yeah, they just really don't do much with it at all, when you would think this would be the place where they could do all the creative stuff they want. But all the creature stuff is mostly at the very beginning and the very end, so... and then lastly, yes, I mentioned a battle. That's one thing about the first movie, was that it was at a time where we had, like, you know, Alice in Wonderland and Snow White and the Huntsman and all them, where it was like, take all these characters we know and love and not only kind of change their story, like they're doing something real significant by doing that, but put them in, like, armor and make them battle and shit. And it's like armies here and armies there just colliding, and it's this climax that goes on, and that we don't give a shit the whole time or whatever. But the thing about it is that the first movie avoided that. And it was mostly like the dragon and Sharlto Copley and all that stuff. But this one couldn't resist. This one ran out of ideas. It needed the battle. I suppose there's a bit of a difference because one of the armies flies. but that's about it. It still feels like the same old shit. It still feels like the battle now in Wonderland. It still feels like the battle in fucking Snow White and the Huntsman. And whatever. I lost track how many of those there were. But yeah. So it's... so I like it a little better than the first one. But I mean, that bar is really low. So... But I really didn't mind that first 20 minutes. I kind of wish it had been able to keep up with that. But it's weird. You would think Michelle Pfeiffer would be like a real shining moment of this, getting someone of her caliber to kind of have fun in a role like this. But it's when her character gets to shine is kind of the basically the warning that the movie's about to get super boring and super redundant. So yeah, that just really fucked themselves over with that. They had like a perfect little secret weapon here, and they just said, "No, we're not going to use this to its extent. Screw that." Even Charlotte Copley got a little bit to like chew the scenery with or whatever, and Pfeiffer doesn't really get much of that. She's just kind of playing just another version of Charlize in the Snow White and the Huntsman movies. So yeah, that is what it is, really. So, the last one is going to be The Laundromat, Soderbergh's new movie with his frequent writer Scott Z. Burns, with a really big cast list, a very appealing cast list, going into the territory of the Panama Papers, which, as soon as that news broke, a lot of the things I was saying was, well, how soon before we get the movie on this? It's like, is it going to be like immediately? Is it going to be? And everybody was predicting like it's going to be a movie called The Panama Papers. I guarantee it. Well, not quite. They kind of went around you on that, but that was something that was like, you kind of wonder how it's going to translate to film this story, because there's the whole thing because there wasn't a whole lot of coverage on it. It was one of those things where for like a couple of days, at most a week, it seemed like it was going to be a super super big deal, and it was going to be one of the biggest things ever. And then like most big news stories, it just kind of faded out. And it's like to think of all the reasons that probably happened, like whether it be like how sort of the whole kind of thing. You throw me in there also. It was really kind of hard to decipher what the hell it was exactly and what everything was. There was like so much to it and like so many layers to it. And I think the reason it kind of floated out of like the news and coverage is because people got tired of trying to people just couldn't decipher it, so they just moved on to something else and it wasn't intriguing enough to people or something. So how do you translate that to a movie? It pretty much makes sense to go, like, you can say that he's basically doing the Adam McKay thing, because it would have been like right after The Big Short, that all this was like in the news. So and then McKay kind of like made that film style go on into stuff like Vice. So it's like the stuff that could be like really dull to an audience going to a movie, and it's like because it feels like you could have made something along the lines of like All the President's Men, with material like this, but it's like, who would that appeal to? Who would watch it? Can you make it in any way entertaining whatsoever without it just basically feeling like a documentary? So yeah, this was probably the best way to go. To sort of do even if you are gonna get endless comparisons to Adam McKay and the stuff that he does, you might as well run with it. And it still feels like there's so many Soderbergh angles in it, and the way he sort of takes the freedom in how he shoots certain scenes. You can still tell it's a Soderbergh movie, even if it has that Adam McKay style. And it's also worth noting going into this about how, like, just like a couple of days ago, it was kind of back in the news where the lawyers that are involved in the actual case were trying to like sue the makers of the movie and basically trying to get the movie stopped. Which they I think they waited a little too long, because here it is in all of its glory. So then again, so yeah, there was that. So we open with Gary Oldman and Antonio Banderas, who are basically the two people that like you go through all the weaving and all the mazes and all that, and eventually we get to these two. And they're explaining to us, the audience, exactly how this is in terms that hopefully we can understand. It's basically like the Gary Oldman Banderas scenes are basically feature-length versions of the scenes like Margot Robbie and Anthony Bourdain and The Big Short and all that. So which is helpful, and they do it in a way like casting Gary Oldman and Antonio Banderas, like two of the most magnetic actors ever. To do this kind of makes it feel a bit fresh. So and they kind of do grab your attention. So those scenes do work. I did hear a lot of complaints when the trailer came out about Oldman and like his accent and how he seemed to be super hammy and all that. And it's like accents and super hammy. It's like, who the fuck do you think Gary Oldman is? It's like, and I don't even mean that as like an insult. It's kind of half of a compliment. But so yeah. So I really like the Oldman Bandera scenes, especially with some of the creative ways in which they handled it and the way some of the scenes are shot. Like there's one particular moment when it's going to transition from them to a scene with Streep. And they're walking through a supermarket, and it's like they're shopping. And then in one shot, this whole scene is where we follow them through the store, and then Streep walks by, and their dialogue transitions into Streep's dialogue, and the camera just starts to follow her, and it doesn't cut or break. And it's like the way they introduce that, to where it's almost like a stage when the two of them are on screen. I think is a really kind of engrossing way to bring this material out and explain it. So I actually really love the style of it. Like, in a way, if The Big Short and Vice really aren't your thing in their style, Soderbergh kind of elevates it a little bit, like, in his own way. Like I was saying, you can see the comparisons, but it really is a Soderbergh movie at the end of the day, so there's that. And, yeah, so I can understand, though, even with that there kind of explaining it for us, I still have heard complaints that, like when it was at TIFF, that the movie is confusing. And yeah, that is kind of the thing where it's like, the story itself is, this is kind of hard to explain, it feels like you can follow the movie itself, but it's the details in between that people are going to kind of struggle with. But it's like they explain it enough and lay it out enough that you can at least get from scene to scene, even if the content in some of the individual scenes is going to make you say, what the fuck are you talking about? How does this link to this? What is this? And so yeah, so they had a lot on their hands tackling this material at all. But I think for the most part they did succeed, at least to me, in making something like entertaining and engrossing and giving you just enough to get it, even if you still don't quite, if you know what I mean. So, throwing in stuff like the Streep character kind of being a central part of this. They build it like she's going to be the main character, but it is definitely ensemble the more it goes on. But Streep's kind of the one that we keep circling back around to. And the interesting thing about that is that it's the way they sort of portray the people who get screwed over by stuff like this, like the smaller people and the vulnerable people. And I think Streep plays that just about perfectly, because you look at like the way, like Sharon Stone's one scene really plays into this as well, and a couple of Jeffrey Wright's scenes as well, where they really play off just like the soullessness that some people can have towards, like, you know, the more meek or the more vulnerable or whatever, which is how, you know, gigantic crimes like this end up happening, because people just do not give a shit about people, and will make that happen if it makes them and other people like them richer. And Streep's character being a victim of this, she plays it with, like, there's, like, so much humanity in her scenes that's just kind of a perfect contrast to that, and really kind of gives off the vibe of the damage that this stuff does, especially when they have scenes together. Like the scene between Streep and Sharon Stone is like, you just really get a sense of the distance between the regular people and the people committing stuff like this. And it's, yeah, so stuff like that I think is really well done. Streep is really, really damn good in this. Like, really good. So, yeah, and you add that on top of the style, and you would think maybe there'd be like a tonal problem, because the Streep scenes are so serious and heartbreaking, when the movie is trying to be so stylish about the material. But I still think, I think there's enough of a balance that they get all the points across that they need to. Even with little scenes, there is a scene like right in the middle with Will Forte and Chris Parnell, and it's like 30 seconds long. But it is like, it's very sudden, and it's very dark, but also very funny. makes a point, and it's also really creatively shot as well. That whole scene, it's just like a 30-second scene, and it's great. And it's like I said, maybe another movie could have felt really out of place, and I could see people thinking the movie maybe bounces around too much. But I don't know. This whole movie was just working for me. But I at the same time I can see people being so annoyed with this movie. Which is kind of where it's like I guess it's one of those things where I just got lucky that I kind of gelled with it immediately. Because I think if you're not into it right away, you're probably not. You're probably definitely not going to be able to get into it. If you're not in like the first 10 minutes or so. But if you're into it in the first 10 minutes, you really should be okay. And like I said, there is a lot of bouncing around, and we do bring in some new characters. But I do think it's also one of those cases where, like, I feel like each segment may appeal to another person, where, like, somebody might say they love the street stuff, but they don't care for the guy that's banging his daughter's friend, which is a whole subplot. Or it's like, I could see people saying they weren't too much in the street thing, but they like the dude banging his daughter's friend storyline. And so there may be like divisiveness in regards to what the better parts of the movie are, but I think that's another thing that kind of makes. I mean, it would be great if it all kind of fit as a whole, and there is like one or two moments here where I kind of want there's a segment towards the end that goes into a much darker aspect of this, and it was kind of losing me by the time we got there. But I'd pretty much more or less been won over by the movie as a whole by then, so it wasn't like too damaging to the rest of the movie for me. So, yeah, and every now and then there's a really good line. Oldman gets the line. What is it? Bad is it's you have to hear it in context, but it's like bad is a big word for being such a small word. It's just lines like that just kind of work for me also. So. Yeah, and then like I said, it's really got that Soderbergh style going on. There's a lot of really nice long takes without drawing too much attention to themselves. There's the final shot of the movie is a very long take but is so incredibly well done. It might be one of my favorite shots of the year with how much they put into this and what it ultimately leads to and all that. It may be extremely heavy-handed for some people. Like I said, maybe just downright annoying for some people. But I was really into this. I was like really satisfied with this movie, so that makes me happy. So I think that's gonna be what we leave this on. So I have to do 2 verses like right after this, and then I already shot some stuff with my brother that'll be coming out, and then eventually. Doing this a couple more times will get us to the next prediction video, and then so on. So I think that's, and we may or may not be talking about this again a little bit, at least in one instance, on that prediction video. So yeah, so until all that stuff, I think that's it for this.